A man is crouching in the dark. He's on the run from the most powerful government on earth. Every intelligence agency in the Western Hemisphere wants him dead. His own country has put a price on his head. There are kill squads hunting him through these mountains right now. And he is burning money to stay warm. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. $2 million in U.S. currency, stacked, lit, and fed into a fire while his daughter shivers beside him. His name is Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. At the peak of his power, he controlled 80% of the world's cocaine supply. He smuggled 15 tons of the drug into the United States every month. He once offered to personally pay off Colombia's entire national debt. All of it, just to avoid extradition. Forbes listed him as the 7th richest man on earth. And he burned $2 million for heat. But here's what I need you to sit with, because this story is not about excess. It's not about carelessness. It's not even about power. It's about what it actually costs to become the most wanted man in the world. To understand the fire, you have to understand the man standing in front of it. Not the myth. The man. Start here, December 1st, 1993. A neighborhood in Medellín called Los Olivos. A two-story house on a quiet residential street. Nothing remarkable about it from the outside. A pink facade, iron-barred windows, a satellite dish on the roof. Inside, Pablo Escobar. On the phone with his son. He'd been on the run for nearly 16 months by this point. 16 months since he'd walked out of his own prison. A prison he had essentially designed and furnished himself, and vanished into the mountains and barrios of Antioquia. 16 months of safe houses, of close calls, of betrayals. Of watching his empire slowly dismantled around him by a coalition of Colombian state forces, American DEA agents, and a vigilante death squad called Los Peeps, who were doing things to his associates that even Pablo's own men found difficult to describe. He was 54 days from his 44th birthday. He would not make it. The phone call to his son Juan Pablo, now calling himself Sebastian, lasted 22 minutes. Colombian intelligence, working with American technology and expertise, had been tracking that signal. The moment Escobar stayed on the line long enough to be triangulated, the clock started. He didn't know that yet. But trace back further. Before Los Olivos. Before the manhunt. Before the empire. Before any of it. There's a village in Antioquia called El Tablazo. And there's a boy who grew up there who could not have imagined any of this. Pablo Escobar was not born into wealth. He was not born in a crime either. Not in any organized sense. His father, Abel de Jesus Escobar, was a farmer. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a schoolteacher. They had 7 children. They lived, by most accounts, in ordinary poverty, the kind that is unremarkable in rural Colombia in the 1950s, the kind that does not attract attention or sympathy, the kind that simply is. When Pablo was young, his mother reportedly told him he would one day be president of Colombia. She was not wrong about his ambition. She was simply wrong about the direction it would take. By his teenage years, Pablo had moved with his family to Envigado, on the edge of Medellín. This is important because Envigado was not just a suburb. It was a specific social world, a network of neighborhoods where poverty and ambition and impunity had been quietly developing their own grammar for decades. Where the formal economy had largely failed young men, and the informal one was beginning to offer alternatives. He started small, embarrassingly small by the standards of what was coming. Stolen tombstones, some accounts say. He and his cousin would steal grave markers from cemeteries and resell the stone. Some accounts dispute this. What's not disputed? By his early 20s, he was deeply involved in car theft, then in kidnapping. Not the mass-scale political kidnapping that would come later, but targeted transactional abductions of local businessmen, quick operations for quick ransom. He was arrested twice before the age of 25. Both times, the charges were dropped. One arresting officer died. Another recanted. This was the first lesson Pablo Escobar learned, and arguably the most important one, that there was no wall between the legal world and the illegal one. There was only money. By the mid-1970s, a new commodity was beginning to flow through these networks. Cocaine had existed as a drug for decades. But a new American middle class with disposable income and a taste for stimulation was creating demand at a scale nobody had anticipated. The supply chains were nascent, chaotic, violent, and extraordinarily profitable. And somewhere in that chaos, a young man from Envigado with a gift for logistics, a total absence of compunction, and a peculiar genius for both brutality and loyalty, was paying very close attention. Pablo Escobar did not invent the cocaine trade. He industrialized it. The scale of what happened next is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. Here's some numbers, not to impress you, to prepare you for the rest of this story. At its peak, the Medellín Cartel was smuggling approximately 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single month. 15 tons. That is 30,000 pounds of product, moved through submarines, aircraft, modified cars, swallowed in condoms by human couriers, sewn into women's girdles, hidden in coffee shipments and flour crates. Colombia's legal flour export industry was, for a time, the perfect cover. The profit margin on cocaine in the early 1980s was, conservatively, 1,500%. The cocaine was worth roughly $2 a gram to produce. It was selling in Miami for $60 a gram. Pablo Escobar was, at various points, pulling in approximately $60 million per day. But numbers like that don't mean anything without a story attached to them. So here's one. In 1983, Escobar's accountants had a problem. Not the problem you'd expect, not a shortage. An excess. The cartel was generating so much cash that the physical logistics of handling it were becoming a bottleneck. You can't deposit $60 million a day in Colombian banks without questions. You can't carry it around without attracting attention. You can't spend it fast enough to keep pace with its arrival. So they stored it. In warehouses, in the walls of houses, in underground vaults, in farms across Antioquia and beyond. And even with all of that infrastructure, roughly 10% of their total cash holdings was being written off every year. Not to seizures, not to theft, to rats, literal rats, eating through the bills, to moisture and mold and the simple physical degradation of paper in the tropics. Pablo Escobar once reportedly told a family member that he budgeted approximately $2,400 a month just to replace rubber bands for the money. Not the money, the rubber bands. This is the context in which $2 million burns in a fireplace. When your enemy isn't scarcity, when your enemy is the sheer unmanageable weight of your own success, money stops meaning what money is supposed to mean. It becomes material, fuel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before the fire, there was the war. In 1989, Escobar ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, a commercial airliner. 107 people, dead. His actual target, a presidential candidate, wasn't on the plane. He also ordered the bombing of the DAS building in Bogotá, the Departamento Administrativo de Seguridad, Colombia's equivalent of the FBI. The bomb destroyed most of the building. 63 people died. More than 600 were injured. In the same year, he had Luis Carlos Galán assassinated. Galán was the leading presidential candidate, a man who had built his entire political career on anti-corruption. He was shot in front of a crowd of 10,000 people. Pablo Escobar killed a man in front of 10,000 witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of the country. Because he could. This was his narco-terrorism phase, a deliberate strategy to use mass violence to force the Colombian government to abandon its extradition treaty with the United States. Because extradition to America was the one thing Pablo Escobar genuinely feared. Colombian courts he could buy. Colombian prisons he could redesign. American federal courts were another matter. The strategy worked. For a while. In 1991, facing enormous public pressure and ongoing cartel violence, the Colombian government rewrote its constitution. Extradition to the United States was banned. Pablo Escobar had held an entire nation hostage until it changed its own laws. And then he surrendered, on his own terms, to a prison he'd helped design in a neighborhood he controlled, surrounded by his own men, with a full kitchen, a football pitch, and a bar. He called it La Catedral, the cathedral. He ran his empire from inside. The Colombian state, for most of Escobar's rise, had not so much failed to stop him as chosen, repeatedly, not to try. This requires some explanation. By the mid-1980s, the Medellín Cartel had achieved something that modern political scientists recognize as a form of parallel sovereignty. In the barrios of Medellín, where Escobar had grown up, Aranjuez, La Paz, Moravia, he was not a criminal. He was functionally the government. He built football fields. He constructed free housing for families who had been living in the rubbish dump outside the city. He paid school fees. He funded churches. He paved roads. The Colombian state was not doing these things. Pablo Escobar was. And so, when the state came for him, or tried to, it was, in many of these communities, experienced as an act of aggression against the patron, not as justice. But eventually the violence escalated to a point where the political math shifted. When you bomb airliners, you make enemies you cannot buy. When you assassinate a presidential candidate in front of cameras, you generate a category of institutional outrage that money cannot fully suppress. By 1992, the DEA had dozens of agents operating in Colombia. The CIA was sharing intelligence. The U.S. military had advisors embedded with Colombian units. And most critically, a covert military intelligence unit, Search Block, had been assembled specifically to find one man. They were helped, toward the end, by an organization called Los Peeps. Los Peeps, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, was nominally a vigilante group made up of his enemies, traffickers he had betrayed, families of people he had killed, rival cartel members. In practice, Los Peeps was carrying out a systematic campaign of assassination against anyone connected to Escobar, destroying his assets, murdering his lawyers, killing his associates, and in some cases their families. The DEA knew about Los Peeps. The Colombian National Police knew about Los Peeps. What was happening? The coordination, the intelligence sharing, the unofficial permission structure was at best a profound ethical compromise. At worst, it was a state-sanctioned death squad operating under plausible deniability. But it was working. Most people watching this already understand that the system's hands are never clean. You know how this works. If this story matters to you, if the gap between what institutions say they do and what they actually do is something you want to keep examining, subscribe. Not for the channel, for the next story, because this one is not the only one. By late 1993, Escobar's network had collapsed to almost nothing. His senior lieutenants were dead or in prison. His lawyers had been systematically murdered. His family, his wife, his son, his daughter, were in hiding, unable to leave Colombia, unable to find a country willing to take them in. He was communicating through a small team of radio operators. He was moving between safe houses every few days. He had fewer than 10 men left around him, and he had not seen his children in weeks. Here's the thing about Pablo Escobar that his enemies found genuinely disorienting. He was a devoted father, not in the complicated, qualified way that people apply that phrase to men who were terrible in every other dimension. In a more direct and uncomplicated sense. His children were, by almost every account from people who knew him, the organizing emotional center of his life. Manuela, his daughter, was particularly close to him. She had asthma. In December of 1992, Pablo Escobar, his wife Maria Victoria, his son Juan Pablo, and his daughter Manuela were hiding on a mountainside in Antioquia. The safe house was cold, dangerously cold for a child with asthma. The altitude, the exposure, the stress, Manuela was shivering. Her condition was deteriorating. There was no heat, or rather, there was no conventional heat, no firewood nearby, no gas, no electricity. There was, however, several $1 million in U.S. banknotes. Juan Pablo, who now lives under the name Sebastián Marroquín and has spoken publicly about this period, has described the night directly. His father, he said, took bundles of cash and burned them to keep Manuela warm through the night. $2 million by his estimate, possibly more. The exact figure is impossible to verify. The act itself is not. Let me ask you to sit with this for a moment. Not with the extravagance of it, with the logic of it. $2 million was, at that moment, essentially worthless to Pablo Escobar. Not because he had too much, though he did, but because he had entered a phase of his existence where money had lost its primary function. You cannot bribe a mountainside. You cannot threaten a child's lungs into compliance. You cannot negotiate with cold. The thing he had built his entire life around, the instrument through which he had purchased everything, intimidated everyone, bent nations to his will, was on that mountainside, just paper. And paper burns. But here is the layer beneath the layer. The same man who burned $2 million to warm his daughter was, at that same moment, still ordering murders. He was still directing violence against the families of people who had moved against him. He was still, by any reasonable accounting, responsible for the deaths of thousands. He was burning money for love, and he was killing people for leverage, and he appeared to experience no contradiction between these two things. This is not a story about a monster who had a human side. That framing is too simple, and it lets us off too easy. This is a story about the specific kind of moral compartmentalization that allows catastrophic harm to coexist with genuine love. The kind of compartmentalization that is not unique to cartels or to Colombia or to the 1980s. The kind of compartmentalization that is, in fact, very common among people who have power, among institutions, among governments. The fire on that mountainside is not the story of a father's love. It is the story of what power does to a person's relationship with reality. When you have operated for long enough in a world where consequences bend around you, where money makes problems disappear, where violence resolves disputes, where the rules that govern other people simply do not apply to you, you lose the ability to distinguish between what is important and what can be burned. You lose the moral weight of things. Manuela survived the night. Escobar moved them to a lower altitude the next day. 12 months later, he would be dead on a rooftop in Medellín, shot once through the ear by Colombian search block forces, though some accounts, including those of his own family, suggest he may have fired the killing shot himself rather than be taken alive. He was 44 years old. Medellín today is a different city. It has been rebuilt, genuinely, substantially rebuilt from the wreckage of the Escobar years. It has won international urban planning awards. It has a thriving tech sector. Its homicide rate, once among the highest in the world, has dropped by over 90%. The city is, in many ways, a success story. Tourists go to see the places where Escobar lived. There's a market for this. Tours run through the barrios. His childhood home in Envigado is a sight. There are T-shirts. Statues appeared and were torn down and sometimes appeared again. Netflix made a show. Pablo Escobar is, 20 years after his death, one of the most recognizable human beings on earth. His son, Sebastián Marroquín, has made a career out of speaking about his father, about the violence, about the consequences, about reconciliation. He has met the children of men his father murdered. He says he does not miss his father, the trafficker. He says he misses his father, the man. He describes a night on the mountain with a particular kind of grief. Not for the money, for what the money represents. That there was a version of his father, a man capable of that instinctive, unthinking act of love, who never should have become Pablo Escobar. Who might not have, under different circumstances, in a different economy, in a different country, in a different decade. But here is what I want to leave you with. We tell the Escobar story as though it is a story about one man. His pathology, his ambition, his violence. And it is that. But it is also a story about demand. Pablo Escobar did not create cocaine addiction in the United States. He served it. He industrialized the supply chain for a demand that already existed, that was growing, that was generated by American consumers with American dollars. The same dollars that ended up being burned on a Colombian mountainside. The banks that laundered his money were real banks. The aircraft that moved his product flew into real airports. The politicians who looked away received real contributions. The DEA agents who coordinated with death squads did so under real institutional cover. The entire structure required participation. Broad, systemic, morally distributed participation. And almost none of the participants on the demand side, on the financial side, on the institutional side, have ever faced anything approaching the consequences that fell on the people of Medellín. Think about what it takes to burn $2 million. Not the act itself, what it takes to arrive at that act. To have accumulated so much that it has no weight. To be so far outside the ordinary human relationship with consequence that the gap between $2 million and 2 million pieces of paper has simply closed. Pablo Escobar did not start out that way. No one does. Manuela Escobar is alive today. She lives in hiding, under an assumed identity, somewhere in Argentina, according to her brother's accounts. She rarely speaks publicly. She was a child when the money burned. She was a child being kept warm by the wages of catastrophe. In D somewhere, in the financial flows that still run cocaine through the same corridors as organization built, in the demand that never actually went away, in the institutions that manage the balance between enforcement and accommodation. The fire is still burning. There are more stories like this one, bigger than one man, older than any cartel. If you want to follow them, subscribe. The next one drops soon, and it starts in a place nobody is looking.